How global supply chains can adjust to a reopened economy is a topic of my conversation today with Thomas Goldsby. He is a professor and Haslam Chair in logistics within the Supply Chain Management Department at the University of Tennessee. Hey, Tom, how you doing?
Doing well, Robert. It's great to be back with you again at Supply Chain Brain.
Good to see you again as well. Thank you so much for being here. Just a general question then. We're looking to see how global supply chains can indeed adjust to a reopened economy. We're assuming such a thing is on the verge of happening. So what should global supply chains be doing in order to prepare?
Well, that's a great question. I think just as, going back a year ago when this pandemic first surfaced, it caught so many companies off guard, and we've learned so much over the past year. And I think throughout the supply chain profession, I've seen nothing short of heroics over the past year. And I think we should be applauded and upheld for getting creative and having the fortitude to see it through. So it's great to be having this conversation now about getting on the far side of the pandemic and how we might react to it. And I, again, would echo the point that companies are so much smarter now than they were a year ago. There were companies that were making investments in resilience and agility and systems that would help them to navigate the perilous times that we've seen. And those companies, I think, managed through the pandemic much more robustly than their peers. And I think those that were not so well prepared learned some really hard lessons over the last year and are realizing that investing in those areas of agility, resilience, and the technologies and people capabilities to have that perseverance, I think is going to be much wiser moving forward.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So managed how exactly? You talk about agility and resilience, which are, clearly things you need to have in a supply chain. Where were the investments? Was it in technology? Was it in people? Was it in infrastructure or business process? Where were they putting their money that put them in a better position than the rest of the pack when this thing hit?
Well, I think going, pre-pandemic, it was probably an interesting portfolio across that spectrum, right? It was efforts to be, I know lean has been thrown under the bus an awful lot over the last year, and I'm a big lean advocate, as you know, and I think companies that really embrace being process scientists, it paid big dividends to understand your processes and know where those vulnerabilities were in internal and external operations. So I would expect that, even though lean's gotten a bad rap in my estimation, knowing your process capabilities really paid big dividends. And so I think there were efforts in that regard. Right along with process goes people, understanding what capabilities your people need to have and where gaps exist in execution systems. And then speaking of technology, I think companies were a little bit reluctant to be making big investments in technology and then also in infrastructure. And wow, this past year underscored that if you had done that homework, if you had made those investments, it was really worthwhile. With regard to supply chain design and infrastructure issues, it was really hard to make any changes once we were in the throes of the pandemic. Everyone was kind of in rush mode, and we were dealing with overtapped capacity. So it was really hard to be making any moves with regard to sourcing in different locations or using different distribution channels. But those who had entertained those alternatives before the pandemic, again, were able to weather the storm, I think, much better. On the far side of all this, I think that it's going to, again, be some portfolio. I don't know about you, Robert, but I find myself fairly fatigued. And I think there's going to be a real need to invest in people and recognize that, wow, we did perform a lot of heroics over the past year. We probably can't expect people to continue working, frankly, as hard as they've been working in the future once we get on the far side of this.
You can't keep people in crisis mode all the time because then they don't even recognize that they're in a crisis.
Exactly.
But let's talk about people for a minute. We're looking at, we had extremely low unemployment just prior to the pandemic. And if the economy does come roaring back, like we're all hoping and expecting it to do so, we could be right back in that position again with not enough people to do the skilled labor in the supply chain. How can companies prepare for that?
Well, I had an opportunity just a couple of weeks ago to do a tour of some operations. We're doing some research here at the University of Tennessee looking at urban logistics. And so we looked at
Mm.
a variety of pure play operators, as well as 3PLs, as well as some companies doing direct to consumer. And as we traveled the upper reaches of the South and the Midwest, we were hearing that their labor pool was largely tapped out. We were hearing unemployment in some cities of less than 3%, which is perhaps even further than we were going into the
You're
pandemic.
hearing that now. I mean, just in this last recent.
Already in some metropolitan areas, we're hearing of that circumstance. And we're hearing companies having to get really creative, flexible hours as an example.
Mhm.
It's not just, hey, we need you for these days and these shifts. It's like, when can you be available to us? And we'll figure out how to coordinate the work when the staff can be available, which is some measure of desperation by my estimates of that. Obviously, pay increases. I heard one service provider say that their pay had increased 30 to 40% over the past year, which is astonishing.
Wow.
And so, those are a couple of ways. It's
What
the
level is
first
that? What level is that happening, Tom? I mean, we're talking about at one level we have warehouse workers and drivers, and then we have supply chain analysts and managers and executives. Where is the big issue within a total organization?
I think it's all the above to some extent, but where I was able to observe it was in fulfillment centers in the warehouse.
Mm.
Is where I sense a great deal of desperation. I hate to use that word, but that's what I really witnessed. And again, having to get creative, having to dig deeper into your pockets to pay a higher wage.
Mhm.
And then also a much more receptive attitude toward robotization and cobotization,
Right.
a topic that
Yeah.
we've talked about in previous conversations.
That would seem to be the obvious move is to, if you can't find the people, you automate,
Right.
but no one's going to automate everything. So you're still going to need people in some ways. Yeah. You mentioned urban logistics. That's interesting because that's a big issue right now, isn't it? Especially since a lot of smaller DCs are popping up in urban centers to reach e-commerce shoppers faster. Are you seeing that? And is that creating issues of, I mean, if you're in an urban center, you might have even more trouble finding people because they're otherwise employed elsewhere. I don't know. Uh, what is the deal there?
No, absolutely. So as we speak of the logistics industry, perhaps being very hot and getting hotter, that's
Hmm.
particularly true of urban logistics. And you mentioned the space issue as well. It doesn't go without notice that we're telecommuting, if you will, for this interview. And so many of us have been working remotely. And it seems like that seems to be a big question about what work will look like for office environments moving forward.
Hmm.
But meanwhile, that space is in great demand for urban fulfillment. So we might be seeing an interesting transition. It would call for some rezoning of properties. But just as we've seen some of those dilapidated shopping malls being converted into e-fulfillment centers, who knows, we might be seeing parking garages being repurposed. We might be seeing some office space being repurposed. But going back to the labor issue, it's incredibly difficult to find staffing for e-commerce. Takes up more space and it takes more touches, more people to do that work just by its very nature.
I'm going to go back to what you're talking about, lean strategy. You said that we're sort of thrown under the bus during this time. Specifically, just-in-time inventory strategies. Companies are realizing that they didn't have enough buffer stock to respond to the pandemic when their upstream supply got choked off. Do you think that companies now will be looking to increase inventories? I mean, if not throw lean under the bus, at least create a greater buffer stocks, even though that's somewhat of a drag on the balance sheet. Long term, do you think that'll be a strategy?
Yeah, I think we're going to be entertaining investments in inventories in various forms.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly physical inventory, maybe having a little more healthy safety stock than we were holding before. But I think also an inventory of suppliers. Maybe we won't be so dependent
Right.
on one or a few key sources of supply, but we'll want to have a broader inventory, if you will, of suppliers and supply locations. I think that there's going to be an attitude of receptivity toward making some of these plays on inventory of, yeah, like I said, physical inventory, but also inventories of relationships, if you will.
Yeah. It was long said that information replaces inventory. And I'm wondering in in this new era, whether agility replaces inventory to a certain extent. If you do increase your supplier base, if you do have better communication and you are more agile, maybe you don't need to stock up huge amounts of inventory. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, well, we've been doing research on supply chain agility pretty intently over the last 2 years at UT. And what I've come to appreciate out of that work is that I always thought agility meant moving really fast. And that's one component of it, but flexibility is
Mm.
the other key
Not
component.
just speed, but flexibility. Yeah.
Absolutely. And what I've come to appreciate is that agility really means creating options, alternatives, not being painted into a corner. And I think a lot of companies found themselves painted into a corner. They were overly dependent on a key source of supply. They were overly dependent on maybe their own capacities, what have you. And I think agility does mean creating some degrees of freedom, some options that allow you to maybe you know, run down the main street when things are going well, but to create some side avenues to yourself when things become a little bit jammed up.
Well, maybe some important post-pandemic lessons to be learned. Maybe companies will really take this to heart for once and make these important moves. Tom Goldsby from the University of Tennessee, thanks for explaining what some of those moves might be. Really appreciate having you with me. Thanks a lot.
Always a pleasure, Robert. Thank you so much.